Hi there. Welcome back to our special program, Voices and Votes, on the ongoing Lianghui. I'm Yang Rui. The most eye-alluring media coverage or front-page stories about the Lianghui, I'm afraid, is the issue of how to undertake fiscal and tax reform, which draws a lot of attention at this moment. Poverty alleviation and rural revitalization strategy will be accelerated. New tax systems at the national and local level are taking shape. Enterprise and individuals at home and abroad are more interested in China's first property tax, easing tax burden and preferential policies to boost innovation and foreign investment. How can we interpret Beijing's deepening economic reform? What kind of opportunities will these policies bring? And how do we compare these reforms with other countries, especially on tax reform? To discuss these and more issues about China's deepening economic reform, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Zhao Zhongxiu, Vice President of the University of International Business and Economics, and Mr. Charles Liu, Founder and Chairman of How Capital. We shall also cross over to talk with Professor Steve King in Brussels, Head of the School of Economics and Politics and History at Kingston University. And in Hong Kong, we'll be talking to Mr. Robert Cab, the Director of the Economist Corporate Network. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Professor Zhao and Charles, so what are your comments on the avowed goal of both economic and social reforms that Premier Li Keqiang delivered at the opening ceremony?
I think after the 19th Party Congress, it became clear that China's entire economic structure is going to undergo a major fundamental shift. That includes things like environmental protection, poverty alleviation, upgrading of manufacturing, getting rid of excess capacity, especially those of the low grade. And it's a fairly comprehensive plan. And part of that plan, of course, is, the fiscal issues, because fiscal policies not only generates revenue for the government and allows the government to spend it in such a way as to guide the direction of the economic growth.
You seem to have missed the most important sexy issue about the middle income trap. We have passed the Lewis turning point. Exhaustion of the labor dividends really capture attention these days for all policy debates on China. So, Professor Zhao, what do you make of the most interesting points about Premier Li's government work report?
Premier Li's report follows the new concept of development and takes the concrete step to implement this, and so it's a big change. So that's to pursue the high quality of the development. So then consolidate the basis for this development, and there'll be pursue the inclusive of this development. So that's for the to promote the fundamental change for both for the business and for the individuals.
I believe Europeans have been following very closely the process of China's economic reform, which is comprehensive and very deep. It means reallocation of the interests of those interest groups. That means painful and even dangerous reforms. A lot of risks lying ahead. So, Professor Steve King, what do you think of the challenges that China is facing?
Well, one of the most important challenges is not to get yourself caught up in the same mistakes about the role of fiscal policy that the West has done, because the common belief is that taxes are necessary to fund government expenditure, and that if there weren't taxes charged, the government couldn't construct social security systems or infrastructure and so on. That is rather like believing that the Earth is the center of the universe and the sun orbits the Earth every day. It's actually the opposite. The government does the spending. The government creates the money by doing the spending, and the real role of taxation is not to generate revenue for government spending, but to take the money out of circulation, because, of course, given the scale of government spending, if you didn't remove it by taxation, you'd increase the level of money in the economy economy by of the order of 20 or 30% per annum and have absolutely runaway inflation. So the real role of taxation policy is not to fund the government, it's to have redistributional effects. That's definitely the case. It's to tax things like property speculation, to bring that under control, but it is not to raise revenue for the government. That said, the revenue the government generates out of its own capacity to create your currency, that has to be used in sensible projects. You don't want to be having projects building statues to obscure past political leaders. You want to be building infrastructure in the way that China has been doing for the last 10 years.
Robert, do you think China is running a default economy, meaning we have to face a lot of local debt, but taxation reform may help alleviate our concerns? Do you think observers in Hong Kong see eye to eye with the reforms that are to be rolled out through this plenary session?
Well, Hong Kong could actually use a property tax itself, exactly for the reasons that Professor Keane was mentioning. You have rampant speculation here, contributed both by local Hong Kong investors as well as, at least the press seems to feel, notoriously mainland investors. But anyone can speculate on property, and so the lack of a property tax is noticeable here. There seems to be a broad consensus that China could do with a property tax. I believe observers here and around the world would agree with that. And to your original question regarding the leverage that's underpinning growth, that also has to be addressed. A big part of that leverage is coming from local governments forced to rely on land sales in order to raise money for their projects. So if you could have a property tax that then allows collection at the local level, that could have a fundamental impact on what is the #1 risk we see at the Economist Intelligence Unit regarding China's growth, which is this huge amount of debt leverage.
Charles, should we be confident about China's government's debt, especially considering fraudulent data from local governments? And to what extent will it influence China's economy?
Well, I think Robert had just addressed part of the issue, namely local government debt. And whether or not the growth rates are 6%, 7%, or 10%, or minus, I think after the 19th Party Congress, it's become clear that transparency is going to be a very significant factor in terms of whether or not government officials get to become government officials. But I think Robert's point is very important. The property tax is, for almost all developed countries, a means of generating revenue at the local level, instead of relying, as we've seen in the last 30 years in China, on land sales. Property tax will be able to generate revenue and address some of the debt issues of the local government. Central government debt is not that bad. The level is not that high. In fact, it's reduced a little bit this year. But I'd like to go back to what Professor King had said about generating revenue for government, taxation. I think China's situation may be somewhat different from the other countries because it's centrally planned. And without having the government doing what it did for the last 30 years, it would not have had the growth. And basically that means the government planned and spent masses of money on infrastructure, because without infrastructure you can't really do manufacturing, you can't really do development, you can't have supply chains. So under a centrally planned system, you can actually use fiscal policies, including generation of revenues, in many more ways than a non-centrally planned economy. Of course, China is moving more and more toward the market, but in terms of the macro side, it is still heavily planned.
Despite dynamics of domestic spending, Professor Zhao, the disposable income of the middle class has failed to increase in our living memory. Do you think the latest measures on personal income tax will help show up the purchasing power of the middle class, and in that way we can help remarkably improve domestic consumption instead of relying on export growth?
The income tax for China didn't change for the past 7 years. But the past 7 years, economic situations have changed dramatically. And and also for the tax system is the basing on the individual income, not the basing on the family expenditure and the cost. So that it should be adjusted to consider this the change in the composition of the consumption. For example, now while the family should spend money on the education on others. So I think it should be changed to rationalize these consumptions and then release more put power for the consumptions.
Charles, do you agree that personal income tax will help stimulate domestic spending and help alleviate the taxation?
I think the problem is Chinese may be somewhat different than the other developed countries.
You're talking about China exceptionalism.
Yes, absolutely. Chinese are savers. I mean, Chinese are savers. And there's very little you can do about this thousands of years of tradition. I think it would take some time for that consumption attitude to change. It may take 1 or 2 generations or maybe even more. But as for consumption, there's no question that increases in consumption is already taking place significantly, even though the tax format has not changed. But what has changed is disposable income is being increasing significantly at a rate that's above the growth rate of the GDP.
But we got the opposite feeling about the disposable income for the middle class. You are a capitalist, so your perception may be an exception. Let me turn to Steve for the European perspectives on what is called law-based taxation reform. What does that mean for the public?
I think in taxation reform, unfortunately, first of all focuses on the belief that taxation generates the revenue government needs, which is false. It's, as I said, it takes revenue out of circulation. And income tax in particular has proven to be an ineffective means to control limit the growth and inequality in the West. So you have enormous complaints right now, quite justified complaints amongst Western workers and Western middle-class people that they can't evade the taxation, whereas the wealthy can. You read of things like the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers and so on, where wealthy individuals, including ex-prime ministers of the UK, have located their revenue in the Cayman Islands and therefore pay minimal taxation rates, which is not the sort of thing which is available to the average working class person. So income tax puts, I think, too much of a burden of taking the government money out of circulation, which is what taxation does, than in other forms of taxation. I would prefer to see China experimenting with things like transactions tax, which is much harder for the wealthy to evade if the transactions are charged on corporations. China needs to be imaginative and actually properly understand the role of taxation, which frankly Western governments do not understand. And on that basis, being a command economy gives you a great advantage you should not lose too rapidly.
Thank you so much. Steve, one of the 3 major tasks for President Xi Jinping and his team to tackle, to survive possibly the middle-income trap is how to diffuse the financial risks or systematic financial risks. The other 2 issues on the agenda of President Xi Jinping will be poverty alleviation and environmental protection, to have environmentally friendly development to sustain the growth. What do you think of our efforts to diffuse financial risks? Are we able to employ fully and effectively all the tools in the box?
Well, I have to say, since I'm from the financial sector, and I've been in the financial sector since 1975, so that's 40-some years, I can tell you the Chinese financial system is still quite fragile. It is subject to, if it is subject to big swings, it's systemic. The problems could be systemic. And this is why after the 18th Party Congress 5 years ago, we've had some serious issues with P2P lending, shadow banking, trusts, and other type of things which were not based on the real economy, but playing with money, in other words, playing with financial and capital markets. So I think the risk of a systemic nature in China is very serious, because the regulators are not really acclimatized to this massive scale of potential financial issues. and that also there are just too many people moving into the financial sector, and it really has to be controlled.
That will be a devastating impact upon the development of the real economy if people only focus on the fictional economy or financial speculation. Now, Professor Zhao, obviously measures have been taken to tighten control and grip at, with, for example, outbound capital flight, unbound insurance, as well as property developers such as Wang Jianlin have come under fire and severe scrutiny. Do you think, among all other options, this helps lay the groundwork for systematic control and prevention of financial risks?
Yes, this is the critical measures to stop these the speculations. Actually, I would say speculation for the future of the economy and or even currency. So there are also these the deals and action is deal with the either for the foreign investment and also with the domestic the value of the assets. So that's they've tried to change these portfolios. But the challenge is when they do this, well, as a very old story, that's you use the foreign currency, but you didn't make it, and that's problematic. So the draw more the resources out of the real economy, and they didn't make the real contribute to the China's export merchandise, and there were too many things in this where the how to say, they're not the economy, that's in the assets of like the football club and so the hotel, whatever.
Movie studio.
Yeah, so that's that's not helpful for the real competitiveness of the Finnish economy. So that this expansion is you can see that this the value the value in the assets is quite fluctuated, or is the how to say this not the real, but the liability is the real.
Gentlemen, I have conducted an online debate about how to avoid having a repeat of the financial meltdown that we had 10 years ago, because there has been a popular rumor that every 10 years we're going to have the cycle theory, the financial crisis that first broke out in Wall Street. Let's take a quick look at the online debate that I hosted. very interesting online debate. But welcome back, gentlemen. Charles, what do you make of the so-called law-based taxation reform? Because Steve in Brussels fell short of mentioning or giving a direct reply to the definition of this catchphrase.
I think there are two major aspects to this. Law-based means it has to go through a legislative process. And going through the legislative process means hearings and decision-making by the legislative organs, which means decisions on taxes will no longer be decided by simply government officials deciding so. It would have to go through the People's Congress. So the two sides, one, the power of the People's Congress increases in terms of execution of government policy. Two, the process of setting up specific legal framework for taxation now has to go through the process of legislating, which means hearings and discussions and debate.
Let me go back to Robert in Hong Kong. Hi, Robert. Now, people are talking about whether we're going to enjoy more of the laissez-faire market reforms with political control being tightened at this moment in the new era. So lawmakers may play a more active role in shaping the law-based taxation. Now, what do you think of what's going on in this domain? And do you think lawmaking bodies have been enshrined? I mean, they've been given more powers. So they've been authorized to examine very closely whether measures should be taken legally instead of having rule by decree.
Well, it's a very interesting question. I would think that the majority of observers, at least myself, are wanting to see what this all means. The general perception of things in China is that there's this huge consolidation of power going on, and to Charles's points, that the lobbying that indeed could be taking place right now during the two sessions, we don't hear so much about. I'm not saying it's not happening, it's just not something that seems to be the narrative that applies to China. So there'll be a lot of interest. I think a key phrase that gets repeated a lot around the world, it seems, is Liu He's comments at Davos about the world being, looking forward, the world will look forward to a lot of, he meant pleasant, but anyway, he said surprises. He said that we'll be very surprised by the sorts of reforms that are going to be forthcoming from China. That would be great to see, because there's a sense that China is stepping away from the market playing a role and moving more towards central planning. I have a suspicion that's probably not the case, but so far, based on what we've been seeing and hearing the pronouncements out of Beijing, there does seem to be a consolidation. So we're really hoping what Liu He promised at Davos will take place, and we'll see a lot of surprising market-oriented reforms.
Robert, at least 7 to 8 years ago, we did have a property tax approved by the National People's Congress, our lawmaking body. Why do we mention the necessity of drafting a property tax again this time around? Do you think we're going to face more frustrations, if not opposition, in the first and second tier cities? Because we have so many interest groups who have bought multiple properties, right, and therefore we can imagine easily where the opposition comes from.
Yeah. Well, this is just it, and this is a distinguishing feature of Chinese political economics going back not just years or centuries, but even millennia, where you've had local power bases that are kind of in constant negotiation with the central authority. That doesn't mean China hasn't had a unified power structure. It has. That's one of the other distinguishing features. But it's been unified with this kind of trade-off between local authority and a central authority. So you're quite correct with that question, and I don't know of a simple answer. But given that there was this earlier passage of a property tax, I don't know how thorough the law was, but I do recall it being discussed and implemented in some ways, but it obviously hasn't taken place in a really meaningful way. So that's going to be key. Can the central government push something through? Will the local authorities accept it? Or there might be something in between where you would provide the opportunity for local governments to set their own tax rates. That's actually something we have where I come from, the United States. You have varying tax rates between states. So California, a very desirable place to live, actually has a very high tax rate, where states like Texas, nothing against Texas, I know I'd get Texans angry at me if I said anything disparaging about the state, but they have no personal income tax at the state level because they have oil revenues that they can use to support their social services. So that type of approach might be interesting for China, might be a way to accommodate local as well as central government interest.
Despite the ongoing investigations about the Russian contacts back in the United States, Steve, my question is very much about whether we have not a very quiet competition between the two largest economies to show up their competitiveness and to win back approval rating in the case of Donald Trump. He undertakes to have a very serious and comprehensive tax reforms aiming to attract more American multinationals back. Now, given such an uphill battle for China to strengthen its competitiveness, what do you make of the essence of the taxation reform that President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang undergo?
Well, again, I think it's focusing on the wrong issue. Taxation, corporate taxation rates can cause companies to decide to locate in one country or another, and what ends up happening out of that is, frankly, a competition, a race to the bottom. And that's happened domestically inside America, where states like Delaware have offered effectively zero taxation and very low regulation on companies to try to attack their business there. And what that means effectively is they're taking revenue away from the state, or more likely they're imposing the burdens of raising that revenue on the middle class, whom you're hoping to have increase in consumption. So I would prefer to say you would try a different approach to taxation rather than income tax, particularly rather than company tax based on profits. Try something based on transactions, which is simpler to collect and gets rid of an army of accountants that are there whose whole purpose is to evade taxation, and have the companies focus on their industrial engineering rather than their financial engineering. It's a very difficult problem, though, because in the West we have a very strong competition between the government structure and the corporations, and frankly the corporations are winning that battle hands down. I don't think you want the same thing to develop in China.
Given the defiance of Wall Street, we don't expect to have a breakthrough in the taxation reform as a result of President Donald Trump's ambition. Let's take a closer look very quickly at VAT, value-added tax.
But value-added tax is a different form of taxation rather than business tax is a flat fee charged. Value-added is a taxation on the value you add to the product or services that you provide. So it is much more precise in terms of taxation. So it wouldn't be a flat tax. It would be more value-based.
What's the thrust of a value-added tax, Professor Zhao?
Well, the reform or the change of the tax system is the purpose is to reduce the burden of the business, especially the smaller business. And so in the past they pay the business tax in 5% or 3%, 5%, or even some like the entainment is even higher. So they change this, but you know, we have conducted the experiment for the past 3 years, and for small business, they benefit a lot from this. But some business, they didn't feel the real effect because they cannot deduct their import. Since for some business they cannot get the invoice for the import, so then they will tax very high, 30% or some even 70%. So their tax burden has been increased, not decreased. But overall, we see makes it more practical. The burden will be decreased, and so that also will simplify the tax code.
17 years have passed since we entered into the WTO, and China has been doing what it can to level the playing field, not only between overseas multinationals and homegrown enterprises, but also between state-owned enterprises and small and medium-sized enterprises at home, to show up the spirit and innovation of the startup companies. Well, so much for this debate on taxation reform and also comparison between the West and China in this particular area. I thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Goodbye.